Dr. Chris Labos joins us from time to time here on the show. He, of course, can be also heard here, in case you want to know, on weekends, Sunday mornings on CJAD 800, on Weekends with Ken. So, Dr. Labos, I wanted to talk about this story that I saw yesterday and kind of keep an eye out for this because I've said in my particular case, I had COVID back in December of 2021, I guess it was. It's hard to remember. Lost some taste, lost my sense of smell to some degree. Much of it still has not come back. But then you hear about other people with other conditions, long COVID. And though it's something we don't like to talk about, I don't think, because we'll assume once you've had it, you're pretty much done and hopefully you won't have any symptoms. This new research suggests that's not in fact the case. So how concerned should we be here?
Well, it depends what you mean by concerned. Long COVID is a real phenomenon, although you do have some people on some dark corners of the internet who want to deny that it exists. But there are people who are left with persistent symptoms 6 months, a year, and as this most recent study is saying, up to 2 years after the fact. And so while it's not most people thankfully recover. A small percentage of people die, and we've seen millions of deaths globally because of COVID. But even amongst the people who recover, and even amongst the people who have mild infections, a certain percentage, and it appears to be somewhere around 10%, a certain percentage do have persistent symptoms and don't recover completely. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because when people become hyper-focused on the mortality data and say, well, 99.9% of people are going to survive, I mean, that's true as far as it goes, but it ignores the fact that some people are left with long-term disability, and that's not nothing. And even something that's perceived as mild, like losing your sense of smell, that actually affects your quality of life to a considerable degree, because so much of what we do, so much of what we enjoy in terms of food and eating and social contact is actually driven by our sense of smell. Most of what we perceive as taste is actually our sense of smell. So if you lose that, that really affects your ability to do a lot of the things that you take for granted on a daily basis. So this is important research because these may not be life-threatening symptoms, but they impede your quality of life. And quality of life does matter. It's not just quantity of life.
Which leads me to my next question, which would be, let's assume that you are one of those people, that percentage that actually has some kind of long COVID symptom beyond what we described, loss of taste or smell, like fatigue and weakness that seem to be a whole lot more serious. At what point do you seek out, medical help? At what point do you go see your doctor? Because part of the impression I'm getting as well is even, doctors don't necessarily understand this all that well either.
Well, yeah. So here's the thing. We sort of know, here's the thing. We know what the issue is. You got COVID and you're left with long-term symptoms. And this is not entirely dissimilar from what we've seen with other viral illnesses in the past. It's not entirely dissimilar from what you're going to see from chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis or something like that. So there are chronic pain, chronic fatigue syndromes that do exist. They are not easy to treat. What makes this different with COVID is the sheer scale of it, right? If COVID had not affected millions of people or tens of millions of people around the world, there wouldn't be the same number of people. What makes this a particular challenge is that rather than having a few thousand people with these symptoms, you have millions of people with these symptoms, when you look at Canada, the U.S., and Europe, and everywhere across the planet. So we sort of know what the problem is. The greatest difficulty is that there's not much that we can do about it because there are no treatments for long COVID. And despite the fact that the NIH in the U.S. dedicated $1 billion to long COVID research, very little of that money was actually transferable into proven treatments. And this was a big controversy a few weeks back when, they were announcing where the money went. A lot of people said, well, we had $1 billion. Why wasn't more done with this to research treatments rather than looking at associations and causes and stuff like that? Because there are no really good treatments. There's only two things that really prevent long COVID. One is being vaccinated. And the second one is the only positive result to come out of clinical trials is metformin, a diabetes medication, where if you were to take it when you get sick, when you get COVID, it's seen to decrease the incidence of long COVID later on. But if you already have long COVID, taking it now is unlikely to make a difference, which is what most people are asking for when they talk about treatments.
So I want to play a clip. Dr. Dawn Bodish, who is an associate professor at McMaster, was on earlier today here on CJD. She was on the Vassie Capello show. talking about new research that they have turned up, which talks about some of the variants and how, we expect these things to return in the fall, but they got back sooner, and then said this, and I want you to comment on what she's saying right here.
We have been trying to, since the beginning of this pandemic, shoehorn this virus into the rules of other respiratory viruses. We've been saying, we're going to need, it's going to hit a seasonal pattern. But in fact, last summer, the wave also started in August, and we've seen this virus around the world causes waves whenever it wants to, not by sort of our traditional seasonal patterns. We've also tried to shoehorn it into requiring one vaccine a year. But when you have multiple waves per year, you likely need multiple vaccines. And just to give you some context, even for influenza, which we've been doing for decades, when you get your flu shot, you get about 60% protection from symptomatic infection, same as the COVID vaccines, and that decreases by 10% every month. So by 6 months, you're not really very protected anymore. And that's fine for influenza because flu season is 6 months long. So you get your flu shot at the beginning, you're protected all the way through. But it's problematic when you have a virus like SARS-CoV-2 that seems to cause multiple waves in a year. That leaves people unprotected for at least half a year. So this is why we have to tailor our vaccination strategies at the virus's schedule, not our schedule, because those two clearly don't match.
Interesting, right? Because typically, as she said, flu season, you get your shot, you're done. Not the same as we're now finding out as far as COVID and the subvariants that are still out there.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think a lot of what we've been talking about has been under the, hope, frankly, that COVID is going to obey typical seasonal variability, and it hasn't quite done that yet. I think people are hoping that it will eventually fall into this pattern. And, if it only peaks now in the fall and winter and then peters out by the spring and we get into that cycle, then we should be relatively okay. But, she is right. Up until now, it hasn't done this. There have been peaks during the summer, and it doesn't go to zero. The thing about influenza is that it essentially goes to zero during the summer, and COVID doesn't do that. So, the once-yearly vaccine may be practical, and that may end up being what we fall into just for practical purposes. And, sometimes the ideal has to give way to the practical just to make things work. But, from a purely biological perspective, yeah, you're right. If you have a virus that is constantly present, that is endemic in the true sense of the word, meaning always around, always circulating, there might be high-risk populations that probably will need a booster every 6 months. That changes based on what the circulating variants are. But it's been very hard to predict the future with COVID, and I think that's the point, is that our strategy does have to change, and it's important not to get locked in. For now, people are talking about a yearly booster because we just may not have the resources to be that adept at changing it every 6 months. So it does take about 3 months for the companies to mass produce these doses, and so an every 6 month vaccine may stretch our capabilities for now. We may have to, increase our capabilities at some point in the future, but I think the point that we have to be flexible and need to reassess is well taken, because what's true today may not be true 6 months from now.
So as a final question then, would the recommendation to someone in one of the more vulnerable groups, so say you're over the age of 65 or 70, to not just simply say, well, I had 4 shots, so I'm done, I don't need to get any more, that's the wrong approach?
Yeah, at this point, the number of doses isn't relevant in the same way that the number of flu vaccines you've gotten is not relevant, right? Every year, we basically have a new flu virus. And frankly, this fall, the COVID variants that are going to be circulating are different than the ones that were, around a year ago. So whatever your previous dosing schedule was, in the fall, there is going to be a new COVID vaccine. The COVID vaccine that's going to be rolled out in the fall is specifically directed against XBB, one of the Omicron subvariants, which is similar enough to EG5, the one that is currently increasing, that it is going to offer you good protection. So whatever happened in the past is in the past. Going forward, if you want to be protected against what we presume to be a fall-winter surge in COVID, I would get the booster shot to protect yourself because, number one, it'll keep you out of hospital, and number two, it will prevent you from getting sick. And, as we said at the top of the segment, it's going to also decrease the risk of long COVID as well, from what we can see. So there's a lot of benefits to it, and fatigue is not a good, COVID fatigue is not a good enough reason to not want to get vaccinated.
Dr. Chris Labos, appreciate it. Thanks.
My pleasure. Take care.
Dr. Chris Labos, there you go. So take whatever information. It keeps changing. It is evolving. That's why I figure it's important to do these things on a regular basis, and that's what he had to say. The fact that you had it 6 months ago, Not enough come the fall. Certainly not if you're in one of those more vulnerable groups.